Some secrets are buried so deep that only blood can bring them to the surface. When 24-year-old Kate Morrison stepped into the grand marble halls of Thornfield Palace that morning, she thought her biggest worry would be remembering which fork to use at the state dinner. She had no idea that by sunset, she would be fighting for her life while uncovering a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the royal family. The palace had stood for 3 centuries, its walls holding countless secrets. But none more dangerous than the one that would soon put Kate's life in jeopardy. What started as a simple fainting spell would reveal a web of lies, betrayal, and murder that threatened to destroy everything the royal family had built. This is the true story of how an ordinary woman became the key to exposing extraordinary corruption, and how one guard's decision to help a stranger would change both their lives forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine marble floors of Thornfield Palace as Kate Morrison adjusted her navy blazer for the 100th time. Her reflection in the ornate mirror showed a young woman trying desperately to look confident, but her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her brown hair. Today was her first day working as a junior curator for the palace's historical archives, a position she had worked 5 years to achieve. Kate had grown up in a small cottage just outside the capital, where her grandmother used to tell her stories about the palace and its mysterious past. Her grandmother, Eleanor, had worked as a seamstress in the palace during the 1970s, before she was suddenly dismissed without explanation. Eleanor never spoke about why she left, only that some places held secrets too dangerous to uncover. Kate had always assumed these were just dramatic tales meant to entertain a curious child. The palace corridors were more magnificent than Kate had imagined. Crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings, and portraits of long-dead royals stared down from gilded frames. Her supervisor, Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, led her through a maze of hallways, explaining the daily routines and protocols. Mrs. Hartwell was a stern woman in her 60s who had worked at the palace for 30 years. She spoke in hushed tones about respecting tradition and never asking questions that weren't directly related to their work. Kate's job involved cataloging and maintaining historical documents in the lower archives, a series of rooms beneath the main palace that housed centuries of records. The air down there was cool and slightly musty, filled with the scent of old paper and leather bindings. Tall shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with boxes of documents, photographs, and artifacts that told the story of the royal family's reign. On her 3rd day, while organizing files from the 1980s, Kate noticed something unusual. Several boxes from 1983 and 1984 were missing from the sequence. When she asked Mrs. Hartwell about it, the older woman's face went pale, and she quickly changed the subject. That night, Kate couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been deliberately hidden. The following week, Kate was working alone in the archives when she discovered a loose floorboard near the back wall. Curiosity got the better of her, and she carefully pried it up. Hidden beneath was a small wooden box containing old photographs and documents. The photographs showed her grandmother Eleanor with a young man in a palace guard uniform, and they appeared to be more than just friends. The documents were letters written in Eleanor's handwriting, addressed to someone named Thomas. As Kate read the letters, her heart began racing. Eleanor had been having an affair with Thomas, a palace guard, and she had become pregnant. The letters revealed that Eleanor had given birth to a child in 1984, a child she was forced to give up. The baby's father was not just any guard, but someone with connections to the royal family itself. Eleanor had been paid a substantial sum to disappear and never speak of what she knew. The most shocking revelation came in the final letter. Eleanor wrote that she had discovered something terrible about the royal family, something that could destroy their reputation forever. She had been threatened and told to leave immediately or face consequences that would affect not just her, but her unborn child as well. The letter mentioned that she had hidden evidence in a safe place within the palace, evidence that could prove what she had discovered. Kate's hands were shaking as she finished reading. According to these letters, her grandmother had given birth to Kate's parent, which meant Kate herself was potentially connected to this palace scandal. The dates matched perfectly with what she knew about her family history. Her father had always been vague about his childhood, claiming he was adopted but never knowing his birth parents. As Kate sat in the dim archive room, pieces of her life began falling into place. Her grandmother's sudden mood changes whenever the palace was mentioned on television, her father's mysterious nightmares, and the way certain topics were always avoided in family conversations. Eleanor had taken this secret to her grave just 2 years ago, but she had left clues for someone to find. Kate carefully photographed each document and letter with her phone, then returned everything to the hidden box. She needed time to process what she had learned and decide what to do next. The weight of this discovery felt enormous, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was now in possession of something extremely dangerous. Over the next few days, Kate tried to act normally while secretly researching the names mentioned in the letters. Thomas Mitchell had indeed worked as a palace guard in the early 1980s, but his employment record stopped abruptly in 1984. She found his obituary from 2015, which mentioned that he had left the palace service to pursue other opportunities and had lived quietly with his family until his death. Kate also began paying closer attention to the palace staff and their conversations. She noticed that certain areas were completely off-limits to her level of security clearance, and that some staff members seemed nervous when discussing the palace's history from the 1980s. There was definitely something being hidden, and it was bigger than just her grandmother's personal scandal. The breakthrough came when Kate was working late one evening in the archives. She heard footsteps above her, which was unusual since the palace closed to visitors at 6 o'clock. Through the ventilation system, she could hear voices from the room directly above the archives. The conversation was muffled, but she clearly heard someone mention the name Eleanor Morrison, her grandmother's full name. Kate carefully made her way to the stairs and crept up to listen more closely. The voices belonged to two men, one of whom she recognized as Sir Richard Pemberton, the palace's head of security. The other voice was unfamiliar but spoke with authority. They were discussing the importance of making sure certain information from the 1980s never came to light, and they mentioned concerns about Eleanor's granddaughter now working in the archives. The blood drained from Kate's face as she realized they were talking about her. Somehow, they knew about her connection to Eleanor and were worried that she might discover something. She had been hired not despite her grandmother's history, but because of it. They wanted to keep her close and monitor what she might find. Kate quietly returned to the archives, her mind racing with the implications. She was not safe at the palace, and her presence there was part of some larger plan to contain the secrets her grandmother had discovered. She needed to find the evidence Eleanor had hidden and get out of the palace before they realized how much she knew. That night, Kate barely slept as she planned her next moves. She had access to the archives for 2 more weeks before her probationary period ended. During that time, she needed to search every possible hiding place her grandmother might have used. The letters had mentioned that the evidence was hidden somewhere safe within the palace, somewhere that would survive even if Eleanor was gone. Kate thought about her grandmother's personality and the places she would have had access to as a seamstress. Eleanor was practical and clever, and she would have chosen a location that was both secure and unlikely to be disturbed. The palace had been renovated several times since the 1980s, but certain structural elements had remained unchanged. The next morning, Kate arrived at work with renewed determination, but also a growing sense of dread. She was walking through the main corridor toward the archives when she felt dizzy and disoriented. The grand chandelier above seemed to spin, and the faces in the portraits appeared to be watching her with suspicious eyes. She had skipped breakfast in her anxiety, and the stress of the past week was taking its toll on her body. Kate tried to steady herself against the marble wall, but her vision blurred and her legs buckled beneath her. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her body hitting the cold marble floor and the echo of footsteps running toward her. As consciousness slipped away, she wondered if this collapse was really from stress and hunger, or if someone had decided she was getting too close to the truth. When Kate's eyes fluttered open, she was lying on a leather sofa in an unfamiliar room. Standing over her was a man in a palace guard uniform, his kind brown eyes filled with concern. He introduced himself as James Sullivan, and he explained that he had found her collapsed in the corridor and brought her to the security office to recover. James appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair and a gentle demeanor that immediately put Kate at ease. As James helped her sit up and offered her a glass of water, Kate studied his face carefully. There was something familiar about his features, something that reminded her of the photographs she had found of her grandmother and Thomas Mitchell. When James mentioned that his father had also worked at the palace many years ago, Kate's heart began racing again. Could this be more than just a coincidence? James seemed genuinely concerned about her welfare and offered to escort her home for the rest of the day. As they walked through the palace corridors, Kate made a decision that would change everything. She trusted something in James's eyes, something that told her he might be the one person who could help her uncover the truth about her grandmother's secrets and the danger she now found herself in. Little did Kate know that her collapse that morning was just the beginning of a journey that would expose decades of cover-ups, reveal family connections she never knew existed, and put both her and James in mortal danger as they uncovered the dark mystery that had been hidden within the palace walls for nearly 40 years. James Sullivan drove Kate to her small apartment in his personal car, a modest sedan that contrasted sharply with the opulence they had just left behind. During the 20-minute journey, Kate found herself studying his profile, looking for similarities to the man in the photographs with her grandmother. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable, from the strong jawline to the way he held his shoulders. Kate's apartment was a cozy one-bedroom space filled with books and family photographs. As James helped her inside and made sure she was comfortable, his eyes lingered on a framed photo of Kate with an elderly woman. Kate noticed his reaction and realized this was her opportunity to test her suspicions. She picked up the photograph and handed it to James. The elderly woman was her grandmother Eleanor, taken just months before her death. James stared at the image for a long moment, his face growing pale. When he looked up at Kate, there was recognition and confusion in his eyes. James admitted that the woman in the photograph looked remarkably similar to someone his father had described from his time at the palace. Thomas Mitchell had often spoken about a kind seamstress named Eleanor who had been forced to leave suddenly in 1984. Thomas had never fully explained the circumstances, but James remembered his father becoming sad and distant whenever her name came up. Kate made the decision to trust James completely. She showed him the letters and photographs she had discovered hidden in the archives. As James read through the documents, his hands began to tremble. The letters clearly identified his father Thomas as Eleanor's lover and the father of her child. This meant that Kate and James were likely half-siblings, both connected to a scandal that had been buried for decades. The revelation was overwhelming for both of them. James sat in stunned silence, processing the fact that his father had kept this massive secret his entire life. Kate felt a mixture of relief at finally understanding her family's mysterious past and fear about what this connection might mean for their safety. They were no longer just random palace employees. They were living evidence of a cover-up. James shared what he knew about his father's later years. Thomas had left palace service abruptly in 1984 and had struggled with depression and guilt for the rest of his life. He had married James's mother in 1987, but the marriage had been troubled. Thomas often drank heavily and would sometimes mutter about things he should have done differently and people he should have protected. Kate realized that her father, who had been adopted as a baby in 1984, was the child Eleanor had been forced to give up. This made Kate and James half-niece and half-nephew, not siblings as they had initially thought, but still family connected by this decades-old scandal. The timing of everything matched perfectly with the family stories she had grown up hearing. That evening, James and Kate decided to investigate further. James had access to areas of the palace that Kate couldn't reach, and he knew the security schedules and patrol routes. They agreed to meet at the palace the following night after official hours to search for the evidence Eleanor had mentioned in her letters. James arrived at Kate's apartment the next evening with a detailed plan. He had studied the palace blueprints and identified several locations where Eleanor might have hidden evidence. As a seamstress, she would have had access to storage areas, laundry facilities, and certain private chambers that had since been converted to other uses. They drove to the palace under cover of darkness. James used his security credentials to disable certain alarm systems and guide them through rarely used entrances. The palace at night was a completely different place, filled with shadows and echoing footsteps that made every sound seem amplified. Their first search location was the old seamstress workshop, now converted into a storage room for ceremonial decorations. Kate ran her hands along the walls and window frames, looking for any sign that her grandmother had left something behind. James used his flashlight to examine areas that might have been disturbed or modified over the years. After an hour of searching, they found something significant. Behind a loose stone in the wall, Eleanor had carved a small symbol, a heart with the initials YM and TM inside. Below the carving, she had scratched a series of numbers that appeared to be a combination or code. Kate photographed everything while James kept watch for security patrols. The numbers led them to their next location, a storage room in the basement that had once housed linens and fabric supplies. The combination opened an old filing cabinet that had been pushed to the back corner and covered with dust. Inside, they found a manila envelope containing photographs, documents, and a detailed letter written by Eleanor just days before she left the palace. The contents of the envelope were explosive. Eleanor had discovered that a member of the royal family had been involved in illegal arms dealing in the early 1980s, using palace resources and diplomatic immunity to facilitate weapons sales to conflict zones. She had accidentally seen classified documents while cleaning offices and had photographed them as evidence. The photographs showed contracts, shipping manifests, and financial records that proved the royal family's involvement in arms trafficking. The profits had been used to fund personal expenses and maintain the family's lavish lifestyle during a period when the country was facing economic difficulties. Several high-ranking government officials were also implicated in the scheme. Eleanor's letter explained that she had been discovered taking the photographs and had been threatened with death if she ever spoke about what she had seen. The pregnancy had complicated matters because killing a pregnant woman would have attracted too much attention. Instead, she had been paid a substantial sum to disappear and warned that her child would be harmed if she ever returned or tried to expose the truth. Kate and James realized they were now in possession of evidence that could bring down the government and destroy the royal family's reputation. The arms dealing operation had likely continued for years after Eleanor's departure, and there were probably other victims who had been silenced or eliminated to protect the secret. As they studied the documents, James noticed something that made his blood run cold. His father's signature appeared on several security reports that had covered up the evidence of Eleanor's discovery. Thomas had been forced to participate in the conspiracy to protect Eleanor and their unborn child, but his involvement had haunted him for the rest of his life. Kate found a list of names at the bottom of Eleanor's letter, people who had been involved in the cover-up or had knowledge of the arms dealing operation. Several of the names belonged to people who still worked at the palace, including Sir Richard Pemberton, the head of security who Kate had overheard discussing her grandmother just days earlier. The most shocking name on the list was that of Prince Charles Edward, the current king's younger brother, who had apparently been the mastermind behind the entire operation. Prince Charles Edward was still alive and held a prominent position in the royal family. He would have the power and resources to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose his past crimes. James and Kate realized they were in immediate danger. They had been in the palace for over 2 hours, and security patrols would soon notice the disabled alarms. They quickly gathered all the evidence and prepared to leave, but as they reached the main corridor, they heard footsteps echoing from multiple directions. James grabbed Kate's hand and led her through a series of service corridors that most people didn't know existed. They could hear voices calling their names and the sound of radios crackling with urgent communications. Someone had discovered their presence, and the palace was going into lockdown. They reached James's car just as floodlights illuminated the parking area. James started the engine and drove quickly toward the main gate, where they could see security guards taking positions. Instead of heading for the exit, James turned toward a maintenance gate that he knew was rarely monitored at night. As they escaped from the palace grounds, Kate looked back to see vehicles following them. James drove through narrow back streets and residential areas, using his knowledge of the local geography to lose their pursuers. They finally stopped at an all-night diner on the outskirts of town where they could catch their breath and decide what to do next. Kate and James sat in a corner booth, surrounded by the evidence that could expose decades of corruption and murder. They knew they couldn't go to the police because the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of government. They couldn't trust anyone connected to the palace or the royal family. James suggested they contact an investigative journalist he knew who specialized in government corruption cases. Kate was hesitant to involve outsiders, but she realized they needed help from someone with the resources and connections to publish their story safely. As they made plans for the next day, Kate noticed a black sedan parked across the street from the diner, the same type of vehicle they had seen at the palace. James saw it too and immediately understood that they had been found. Their lives were now in immediate danger, and they needed to disappear before morning. They left money on the table and slipped out the back exit of the diner. James led Kate to a friend's house where they could hide temporarily, but they both knew this was only a short-term solution. The people who had killed to protect this secret for 40 years would not hesitate to kill again. Kate thought about her grandmother's courage in documenting the truth, even knowing the risks. Eleanor had sacrificed her love, her family, and her future to protect her child and preserve evidence of the crimes she had witnessed. Now it was Kate's responsibility to finish what her grandmother had started. James was struggling with the revelation that his father had been forced to participate in covering up the arms dealing operation. Thomas had lived with guilt and shame his entire life, never able to tell his family the truth about why he had left the palace or why he suffered from depression and nightmares. As dawn approached, Kate and James made a pact. They would find a way to expose the truth about the royal family's crimes, no matter what personal cost they had to pay. They owed it to Eleanor, to Thomas, to the victims of the illegal arms sales, and to the country that deserved to know what had been done in their name. The evidence they had discovered was just the beginning. If Prince Charles Edward had been involved in arms dealing in the 1980s, there was likely much more corruption and criminality hidden within the palace walls. Kate and James were about to embark on a dangerous journey that would test their courage, their trust in each other, and their commitment to justice. Little did they know that their investigation had already been noticed by people with the power to make them disappear forever, and that the next phase of their quest for truth would put them directly in the crosshairs of one of the most powerful families in the world. Kate and James spent 3 days hiding at the home of Marcus Webb, James's childhood friend who worked as a mechanic in a small town 50 miles from the capital. Marcus had served in the military and understood the seriousness of their situation without asking too many questions. His modest house, surrounded by auto repair shops and working-class neighborhoods, was the last place anyone would think to look for palace employees. During those 3 days, Kate and James carefully studied every document Eleanor had hidden. They discovered that the arms dealing operation had been much larger than they initially realized. The evidence showed transactions spanning from 1982 to 1987, involving weapons shipments to at least 6 different countries experiencing civil wars or regional conflicts. Kate found detailed financial records showing that over $40 million had been funneled through shell companies and fake charitable organizations. The money had been used to purchase luxury properties, expensive artwork, and jewelry for various members of the royal family. Some funds had even been used to silence other potential witnesses who had discovered pieces of the operation. James discovered that his father Thomas had kept a private journal during his final years at the palace. The journal, which James had found among his father's belongings after his death, contained cryptic references to guilt and shame that now made perfect sense. Thomas had been forced to falsify security reports and destroy evidence to protect Eleanor and their child. The journal revealed that Thomas had tried several times to find Eleanor and their child after leaving the palace, but he had been monitored and threatened by Sir Richard Pemberton's security team. Any attempt to contact Eleanor or investigate her whereabouts resulted in visits from men who made it clear that his family would be harmed if he didn't stop searching. Kate realized that her father had grown up just 30 miles from where Thomas had lived with his new family. They had been so close geographically, but the conspiracy had successfully kept them apart for their entire lives. Thomas had died never knowing that his son had grown up to have a daughter who would eventually work at the very palace where the cover-up had begun. On their 4th day in hiding, Marcus brought them disturbing news. The local newspapers were reporting that Kate Morrison had been found dead in her apartment, apparently from a drug overdose. The story claimed she had been struggling with stress from her new job and had taken her own life. James Sullivan was being sought for questioning in connection with her death. Kate stared at the newspaper in horror, seeing her own photograph beneath a headline declaring her dead. The story was completely fabricated, but it meant that the conspirators had decided to eliminate her permanently rather than continue monitoring her activities. They had also framed James to ensure he couldn't continue the investigation alone. James realized this was a classic intelligence operation technique. By declaring Kate dead and framing him for murder, the conspirators had effectively erased both of them from normal society. They couldn't access their bank accounts, contact their families, or seek help from official sources without being arrested or killed. Marcus suggested they contact Sarah Chun, an investigative journalist he had served with in Afghanistan. Sarah had exposed several government corruption scandals and had the resources and connections to help them publish their story safely. She also had experience dealing with people who needed to disappear from dangerous situations. Kate was hesitant to trust anyone else, but she realized they needed professional help to get their evidence to the public. Sarah Chun had a reputation for protecting her sources and had never revealed confidential information under pressure. If anyone could help them expose the truth while staying alive, it was her. James called Sarah from a secure phone line that Marcus had set up. Sarah listened to their story and immediately understood the magnitude of what they had discovered. She agreed to meet them at a safe location to examine the evidence, but she warned them that going public with accusations against the royal family would make them targets for the rest of their lives. The meeting was arranged for the following evening at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of an industrial district. Sarah would come alone, and Marcus would provide security by monitoring the surrounding area for any signs of surveillance or danger. Kate spent the day before the meeting organizing all their evidence into a comprehensive package. She created copies of every document, photograph, and letter, and prepared a detailed timeline of events from Eleanor's initial discovery through their recent investigation. She also wrote a personal account of her family's connection to the scandal and the dangers they had faced. James used his knowledge of palace security procedures to create a list of current employees who might be involved in the ongoing cover-up. He identified at least 12 people, including Sir Richard Pemberton, who had been at the palace during both the original arms dealing operation and the recent attempts to silence Kate. The most disturbing discovery came when James cross-referenced the list of names from Eleanor's evidence with recent obituaries and missing person reports. 7 people who had been mentioned in the documents had died under suspicious circumstances over the past 15 years. The deaths had been ruled as accidents, suicides, or natural causes, but the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Kate found evidence that Prince Charles Edward had continued his illegal activities well into the 1990s, expanding from arms dealing into money laundering for international criminal organizations. The profits had been used to fund his lavish lifestyle and maintain his position within the royal family, but had also been used to silence witnesses and eliminate threats. The meeting with Sarah Chun took place as planned, but it nearly ended in disaster. Sarah arrived at the warehouse with 2 colleagues, both experienced in handling dangerous stories involving government corruption. As Kate and James presented their evidence, Sarah's expressions grew increasingly serious and concerned. Sarah confirmed that the evidence was genuine and explosive. She had investigated similar cases involving arms dealing and government corruption, and she recognized the authentic details and terminology that would be impossible to fake. The financial documents alone would be enough to trigger international investigations and potentially bring down the current government. However, as Sarah was photographing the documents, Marcus's radio crackled with an urgent warning. He had spotted 3 black vehicles approaching the warehouse from different directions. The meeting had been discovered, and they were about to be surrounded. Sarah quickly gathered the most important documents while James and Kate prepared to run. Sarah's colleagues had escape routes planned, but the approaching vehicles were moving too quickly for everyone to get away safely. Someone would have to stay behind to ensure the others could escape with the evidence. James made the decision to create a distraction while the others escaped. He would lead the pursuers away from the warehouse, giving Sarah time to get the evidence to safety and prepare it for publication. Kate refused to leave him behind, but James insisted that protecting the evidence was more important than protecting any individual. The chase that followed was intense and dangerous. James led the black vehicles through industrial areas and residential neighborhoods, using his knowledge of local streets to stay ahead of his pursuers. Kate, Sarah, and Marcus escaped in a different direction, carrying the evidence that could expose decades of corruption and murder. James managed to evade capture for several hours, but his car eventually ran out of fuel in a remote rural area. He abandoned the vehicle and continued on foot through farmland and forests, using survival skills he had learned during his military training before joining the Palace Guard service. Meanwhile, Kate and Sarah reached a safe house that Sarah's organization maintained for protecting sources in danger. Sarah immediately began verifying the evidence and preparing it for publication, while Kate worried constantly about James's safety and their chances of survival. Sarah explained that publishing the story would take time because the accusations were so serious that her editors would require extensive verification and legal review. They needed to build an airtight case that could withstand the inevitable attacks and attempts at discrediting their sources. Kate realized that James had sacrificed himself to protect the evidence and ensure that Eleanor's 40-year-old secret would finally be exposed. She felt guilty about being safe while he was running for his life, but she understood that his decision had been the only way to ensure their mission succeeded. Over the next 2 days, Sarah worked with her team to verify the authenticity of Eleanor's evidence and cross-reference it with other sources they had developed over the years. They discovered that several other journalists had been investigating similar allegations, but had been stopped by legal threats or had mysteriously abandoned their stories. Kate provided additional details about the palace's current operations and the people involved in maintaining the cover-up. Her insider knowledge helped Sarah's team understand how the conspiracy had survived for so long and identify potential weak points where they could apply pressure. Sarah's investigation revealed that Prince Charles Edward had used his diplomatic status to facilitate not just arms dealing, but also drug trafficking and human trafficking operations. The royal family's involvement in international crime was much more extensive than Eleanor had originally discovered, and had continued well into the present day. The story was beginning to take shape, but Sarah warned Kate that publication would trigger an immediate and violent response from the conspirators. They would stop at nothing to discredit the evidence, eliminate the sources, and maintain their secrets. Kate's life would never be normal again, and she would need to live in hiding indefinitely. Kate thought about her grandmother Eleanor, who had sacrificed everything to preserve the evidence that would eventually expose the truth. Eleanor had lived her entire life knowing that powerful people had committed terrible crimes, but had been unable to seek justice because of threats against her family. As Sarah prepared to publish the story that would shake the foundation of the government and royal family, Kate wondered if James was still alive and whether their sacrifice would be worth the price they were paying. She also wondered whether the truth would be enough to bring justice to the victims of the crimes they had uncovered. The evidence they had gathered was just the beginning of what promised to be the largest political scandal in the country's modern history. Kate Morrison, the granddaughter of a palace seamstress, was about to become the key witness in a case that would expose decades of corruption, murder, and betrayal at the highest levels of power. But first, she had to survive long enough to see justice done, and that would require staying one step ahead of people who had successfully hidden their crimes for 40 years and had killed to protect their secrets. The hunt for Kate and James was just beginning, and the stakes could not be higher. James Sullivan had been running through the countryside for 18 hours when exhaustion finally forced him to seek shelter. He found an abandoned farmhouse that had been empty for years, with boarded windows and overgrown fields surrounding it. His phone had died hours earlier, and he had no way to contact Kate or know if she was safe. Inside the farmhouse, James discovered that someone else had been using it as a temporary shelter. There were recent food containers, a sleeping bag, and newspapers from the past week. As he examined the newspapers more closely, he found articles about Kate's supposed death and his own status as a wanted fugitive. The manhunt was intensifying, and his photograph was being broadcast on television and posted throughout the region. James was drinking water from an old well behind the farmhouse when he heard a vehicle approaching. He prepared to run again, but recognized a voice calling his name. It was Detective Patricia Winters, a police officer he had known since childhood. Patricia's father had worked with Thomas Mitchell at the palace, and she had grown up hearing stories about the mysterious events of the 1980s. Patricia had been following the case of Kate's supposed death and James's disappearance, and she had noticed inconsistencies in the official reports. The evidence of a drug overdose didn't match Kate's personality or background, and the timeline of events surrounding James's alleged involvement didn't make sense. Patricia had begun conducting her own investigation. James decided to trust Patricia with the truth about their discovery and the danger they faced. Patricia listened to his story with growing amazement and horror. She had always suspected that her father's stories about corruption at the palace were based on real events, but she had never imagined the scope of the conspiracy they had uncovered. Patricia revealed that she had access to police files that could help verify James's story. Over the past 20 years, she had noticed patterns in deaths and disappearances that seemed connected to the palace. People who had worked there or had family connections often died under suspicious circumstances, but investigations were always closed quickly without thorough examination. Together, James and Patricia drove to a secure location where Patricia kept backup files of cases she had worked on. Patricia showed James evidence of at least 15 deaths over the past 2 decades that appeared to be connected to the palace conspiracy. The victims included former employees, journalists who had investigated royal family activities, and family members of people who had discovered sensitive information. James recognized several names from the list Eleanor had compiled 40 years earlier. The pattern was clear. Anyone who posed a threat to the royal family's secrets was systematically eliminated, and the deaths were covered up by authorities who were either complicit or intimidated into cooperation. Patricia had been building her own case against the palace for years, but she had lacked the crucial evidence that James and Kate had discovered. Eleanor's documents provided the missing pieces that connected decades of suspicious deaths to a central conspiracy involving arms dealing, money laundering, and political corruption. Meanwhile, Kate was working with Sarah Chen's team to prepare the exposé for publication. Sarah had contacted several international news organizations and government agencies who specialized in investigating royal family scandals and international crime. The evidence was so compelling that multiple organizations wanted to collaborate on publishing the story simultaneously to maximize its impact and protect the sources. Kate learned that similar operations had been exposed in other countries, where royal families and government officials had used their positions to facilitate international crime. The pattern of arms dealing, money laundering, and witness elimination was consistent with organized crime networks that operated across multiple nations. Sarah's investigation revealed that Prince Charles Edward had connections to criminal organizations in at least 8 countries. The profits from his illegal activities had been invested in legitimate businesses and charitable foundations that served as fronts for continued criminal operations. The network was sophisticated and international in scope. Kate provided detailed information about the palace's current security procedures and personnel, which helped Sarah's team understand how the conspiracy had been maintained for so long. The key was Sir Richard Pemberton's control over information flow and his ability to eliminate threats before they could expose the truth. Sarah discovered that Sir Richard had been involved in the conspiracy since the early 1980s, when he was a junior security officer. His loyalty to Prince Charles